Today we'll be taking a look at Azure Active Directory Application Proxy, or as I like to call it, the new DMZ guard dog. So let's get started. So what is Azure AD Application Proxy? So Azure AD Application Proxy is a service that hosted in Azure that allows you to provide secure remote access to on-premise web applications. This feature of Azure AD enables users to access on-premise applications, web applications from a remote client. It includes the application proxy service, which will run in the cloud, and then also an application proxy connector, which will run on your designated server on-premise. This can work with essentially any web application that uses Windows authentication or integrated Windows authentication. Use a web application that uses form-based or header-based access, web APIs that expose rich applications on different devices, applications hosted behind a remote desktop gateway, and as well as any rich client apps that have been integrated with the Active Directory authentication libraries. So Azure AD Application Proxy, you can think of it as the cloud is really the new perimeter when you think of this. So we'll talk about that, what I mean by that concept. We'll talk a little bit about application proxy concepts, and then toward the end, we'll make it real. Use it in the real world. Well, maybe not a real world scenario, but an on-premise application that's being exposed through the Azure AD Application Proxy service. So let's jump right into here. So when you think of the cloud is the new perimeter. You have all of these cloud services and main cloud providers. So you have Azure for Microsoft, you have AWS. Those are kind of the two market leaders, and then you have Google with GCP. There are other players such as Oracle and IBM, and probably a few others like Alibaba, but the main three that has the most market share today would be Azure. AWS, Amazon AWS has the most market share today. The runner-up would be Azure, and then probably Google would be in third place there. So when you think of the cloud, cloud really now has the best-in-class DDoS mitigation available. So typically, in most cases, through using capabilities in the cloud, you're going to be able to mitigate more DDoS attacks by leveraging the cloud than you would with your own data center on premise somewhere, regardless of what the size of your environment is. Most cloud scale environments is going to be much bigger than anything any company will have on premise themselves for the most part. There's maybe very few exceptions, so large companies that already host their own clouds, and then companies maybe like Facebook. Facebook is probably large enough where they probably for a lot of their servers, they may not benefit from using something like cloud since they're already at that cloud scale and they can host that themselves. Best-in-class identity protection, so using things like Azure AD and the various different services that comes with that. And then best-in-class conditional access, so again, leveraging Azure AD and the various different features to provide conditional access for your end users that's coming in and accessing your on-premise applications through the Azure AD Application Proxy. So when you think about remote access in the past, you have all these caveats. So you had the additional hardware costs. You may have had to maintain kind of a air gap demilitarized zone. So an area between your on-premise network and then your external facing network, where you would kind of put those servers that need to have external access in that area. You have that requirement. You have to be authenticating users at the edge, which is another piece of that. Again, authenticating users to web servers that live in that perimeter or DMZ network, and then maybe maintaining VPN access for remote users. If you don't have those directly exposed, you have to start maintaining all of the VPN hardware and the VPN users coming in, and that's kind of an extra step that the end users would have to do to be able to access those on-premise servers. They would have to have the VPN client installed on their system. They'll have to log into the VPN client, and then they can access those services. So you have those extra hop and complexity for that. So when you think of the future of remote access, this is where the topic for today, Azure AD Application Proxy, come in. So with this, you're using Azure AD as the front door identity provider. And this will be synced from your on-premise Active Directory. So you do have to have domain controllers and things like that on-premise already, and those identities will sync from Azure AD. You also get that additional benefit of policy and conditional access evaluation before the end users ever touch your internal on-prem infrastructure. And the benefit of that is that your application does not have to natively support this in any way. It's just going to be something that by using this feature, any of those web applications that you have on premise can inherit this capability. So for example, you can say, hey, this group of users, if they're coming in from a system that's not from a particular network, don't let them in. Or if they're coming in on a system that's from a certain part of the world, you can say you want to conditionally not let them in based on that. Or if their system fails some type of pre-health check that you wanted to comply with, you can block access to that user. So you have a lot of flexibility to leverage that. And again, as I mentioned, you can have that conditional policy process happen before any traffic is forwarded toward your actual on-prem systems. Other benefit of that is that once you have these applications registered to use Azure AD and to use Azure AD Application Proxy, you can actually track the user usage of these applications published on-prem or in the cloud. So as end users are hitting those applications and authenticating to them, we can actually log and track that, hey, these users are using these particular applications at this frequently, or they're trying to use this application, but they're failing to log in. And all this rich logging data as far as these applications that are being leveraged will be tracked, and you can run reports and get insights on what users are doing. And again, this is above and beyond the application itself supporting any of this capability at all. It's just going to be natively inherited by leveraging the service. The other thing we have, so it allows you for central management points for any of these HTTP-based applications as well. So you can have multiple, what we call the like the connectors that you'll have on premise. You can have different endpoints for those on premise, but when you're managing the application, you have a kind of a central place in the Azure AD portal where you can manage these applications, register them, and do all the setup directly through the Azure portal. And some of the things, like as we mentioned before, there's no DMZ requirement. So there's no requirement for you to place these systems in a particular DMZ area within your network, as long as that wherever they are in the network, they can have outbound internet access to reach the Azure AD Application Proxy endpoints. You're good to go. No VPN required. No additional reverse proxy required. So it gives you a lot of additional capabilities without adding any additional complexity, or very minimum additional complexity to get all of this up and going. So the next thing, so if we move on, so Azure AD Application Proxy, as mentioned, it requires just a lightweight connector that is implemented on premise. So again, this will just be a small package that you will download and install on your system, and there's really no additional configuration once you have it installed. When you download the package, it does generate, it seems like to be a unique package for that particular download, and then it will automatically register itself to the designated Azure AD Application Proxy and Azure AD tenant that you downloaded it from. It only requires connections outbound, and it has very easy redundancy implementation. So how the redundancy works is you can install multiple copies of this lightweight connector on different servers, and you can group them into a central group. You can say, okay, this application, these group of application proxies will handle XYZ applications. So you associate them with each one, and you can place them in different environments of your network. Just in case, like if some parts of your network have better connectivity than others, that may be where you want to place those devices or virtual machines ideally to handle that traffic. It's very easy and transparent to users. So from the user standpoint, accessing the application is very similar to what they would be doing if they're physically on premise, as it will be when they're external. Um, they don't really, like, again, they don't have to connect to a VPN or do anything special. They would just go to the URL that you define for your application and authenticate, log in, and then they're in. As I mentioned, very easy to configure, and it only supports HTTP-based applications. So you have other legacy non-web-based applications, you can't use it with this service, but anything that's HTTP-based, you can put the Azure AD Application Proxy in front of it and gain all of these capabilities. And also you can control access through the proxy by users and groups. So for example, you can say, okay, on the application itself, a user may have, to say group X may have permissions to log into the application and do whatever, but a layer in front of that is on the Azure AD Application Proxy side, you have to grant permissions as well. So you have to say, okay, this group of users is allowed to come in through the Azure AD Application Proxy and access whatever the application is. If you don't have access in both scenarios, like you may have access on the app itself, but if you haven't also been configured to have access through the application proxy, you will be denied access and you won't be able to get in. So you got to just make sure that you have access on the app as well on the application proxy when you set it up. So just keep that in mind as you're going through and looking at everything. All right, so this is a little bit about how this works in action. So from a, you have your Active Directory domain services that's on-prem, and then you'll also have Azure AD Connect that will be used to synchronize your Azure on-premise credentials and user accounts and things like that up into your Azure AD tenant. And then also on-premise, you'll have your App Proxy connector. That's a small, lightweight connector that you install on the system on your environment. And so you have the synchronization going. So all your user accounts will be present in your Azure Active Directory out on the internet. The application proxy connector will make a connection out to the Azure AD proxy tenant and retrieve its configuration based on, okay, what applications, what users and things like that should have access to various different things, what the published URLs are, internal as well as external, and based on that, it'll allow that traffic back in. All right. So as a end user, like if you're coming in from outside, say you go and hit the URL for the external URL for that application, it will go hit Azure AD to authenticate and do various different checks. So the pre-authentication check, if you have that configured, if there's conditional access and things configured, it will go and make sure you validate and pass all of those checks. And then if all that passes and it checks out okay, then what will happen, the application proxy connector and the Azure AD service will negotiate as far as where should it connect to. And then this app proxy then will reach back onto on-prem and connect to whatever that web application that we're connecting to. So the app proxy connector does have to always be available because all the connections will originate from there back into on-prem. So just keep that in mind. And over here on the left here, we're just some of the things we talked about as far as the various different authentication options that's available there. All right, and then as far as installing, it's very simple. It's a very small download. It's less than 10 megabyte. Very fast installation. There's really no additional configuration typically. You can manage with PowerShell if you wanted to make some small tweaks. Other thing, it does require an Azure AD tenant admin account. So when you set that up, you do need to have that admin right. Otherwise, you won't be able to register any applications within your tenant. Do have some lightweight network configuration potentially required. This is only if your system where you have the connector installed if it requires a proxy in order to get out. If it can get out to the internet to port 80 and port 443 without requiring a proxy, then you don't have to do anything additional. Unauthenticated proxies is supported, so you have a proxy that does not require username and password. The application does support that. And then finally, the application proxy server itself does need network line of sight to the on-prem HTTP application. So it needs to be able, if there's like firewalls or anything between the application proxy and wherever the application lives, we need to make sure that the application is configured to be able to talk through whatever firewalls it may be behind it. All right, so publishing the on-prem app using Azure AD App Proxy has a couple high-level steps. So you'll have to configure the on-prem URL, so that's an internal URL for the application. You have to configure the external URL for the application. So when you do that, you will get assigned a custom Microsoft-defined URL that will be provided. And you also can optionally put that behind your own domain name, right? So you have your own domain instead of connecting to like xyzapp.ms appproxy.net for your application. You may connect to xyz.mycompany.com for the application. And then also optionally, you can configure a certificate for your own domain, just so you don't get the nasty like this site is not trusted message in the browser. If you're not using the certificate where the username or where the URL name and the certificate name match. And next, after you've done that, you just need to authorize those users to the application in Azure AD. And anything dealing with conditional access is optional. You don't necessarily have to set up any conditional access policy if you don't need it, but you definitely can do that if you want. All right, so that kind of brings us to a demo. We'll kind of show what this looks like in action.